Good afternoon. I think I have to start with a correction. I'm only an assistant professor. Radical satanic extremism is tearing at the fabric of Scandinavia. Committed by Scandinavian black metal members is a thing that's never been said. And yet, between 1992 and 1994, more than 50 attacks against churches in Norway were committed by members of the black metal community. And yet, these actors were never used as exemplars of a radical extremist culture. Norway was never held up as a supporter of terrorism. White European males were never deemed dangerous extremists. Why should this be so? It's interesting that cultures will define other cultures based on terms that are meaningful to them. But they will use different terms to define themselves. Now, one of these terms is heavy metal, a thing that I am very close to. And it is one of those communal identifiers, it is one of those things that people organize around that gives them a sense of identity, a sense of meaning in a world that sometimes feels meaningless. Now, I think we can use heavy metal as an indicator of other things, of broader cultural mechanisms. By understanding this one subculture, I imagine that it is possible to understand things about culture at large. But for the purposes today, I think first I need to set the stage a little bit. Heavy metal is a musical subculture that is characterized largely by three things: sound, image, and action. First, the sound. What do we hear here besides noise? We have aggressive guitars, we have aggressive drums, we have screaming. I imagine most of you couldn't make out the words. And the lyrics are anthemic, but lyrics and their content is one of the important factors that makes up the sound of heavy metal. But so too is, as we hear here, the delivery, the way these sounds are given to its audience. But there's an important visual element to heavy metal as well. Now, a lot of these elements were defined in the early 80s by bands like Iron Maiden. And we see here on the 1983 cover to their single, The Trooper, many of the elements that have come to characterize heavy metal. We see a decomposing corpse who's named Eddie, dressed in infantry uniform of the British Empire, carrying a bedraggled Union Jack, carrying a bloodied saber. Death stands behind him as he stalks across the battlefield over the bodies of his victims. What do we see here? Militarism, combat, bloodlust, male aggression. There's also an undercurrent of nationalism that we see with the Union Jack, but this wasn't so important in 1983. It came to be much more important in the 90s and in the current century. But this is not the only way that aggression, that masculinity, that combat, that bloodlust are characterized through visual imagery in heavy metal. Good. We see here the Polish band Iprit. And to me, this image is very akin to what we may see in the news these days. The signifiers that they use are signifiers that we see every other week now. We see the combat boots, we see the bandoleros, the bullet belts, the knives, we see the black masks covering their faces. But even more than that, the name itself, Iprit, signals not just combat, but a particular kind of brutal militancy. Iprit is the Polish word for mustard gas, a chemical weapon that was used extensively by the Germans in World War I. Now, these images go together with sound to develop a kind of community identity that is signaled to the outside world. Finally, there's an action element to heavy metal. Now, these actions, these activities may seem to be, there we go, chaotic. This is quintessential male aggression. These are men acting against other men. And it looks like a chaotic, brutal mess. This looks like a street fight. But, interestingly, if we zoom out, we begin to see patterns. We begin to see regularity. We begin to see specific, repeated, repeatable movements. And it turns out that the violence that is enacted within the heavy metal subculture is a very ritualized violence. It's a very regulated violence. And when you take part in what are called mosh pits, you very quickly learn what the rules are. There are rules here. It looks like a bunch of men fighting each other. But actually, it's a communal expression of membership. Now, all of these things go together to build a subculture. Who would be attracted to such a thing? Who was attracted to bloody sabers and the Grim Reaper and corpses and violence against one's fellow man? Well, men. Men of a particular age, college-age men. Mostly European and North American, but increasingly over the last 2 decades, bands have popped up in Iraq, Iran, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, India, Pakistan. Why should young men be so attracted to these symbols, be so attracted to a community that enacts violence through sound, through image, and through action? Well, that's actually a really interesting question. But this all exploded in the early 90s in Norway when black metal musicians, a particular subculture of the larger subculture metal, began to enact violence not within the community, but outside of the community. Many of these musicians were avowed Satanists, so they acted against the church. But they also committed acts of violence against each other. There were brutal physical assaults. There were even a number of murders. And it was a consequence of these that heavy metal, as an overarching genre, came to be called extreme music, which is a badge that its fans have held with honor for the last 20 years. But I still haven't answered my question. Why would men of a particular age be attracted to this kind of imagery? Now, to answer that question, I actually want to go across the globe and look at a different subculture. In 1991, a year before these attacks started, Japanese theorist Nakajima Azusa was looking at the Japanese otaku culture, those people who fanatically collect anime and manga. And she actually said that these collectors, these fanatics, had something she called communication deficiency syndrome. She said they were incapable of acting in society. She said that this fanatic collection was a way that they could emulate this invented sense of community. Now, I disagree with this. And a few years later, Hiroki Azuma did as well. He said, no, that's not what's going on. These people, in fact, are communicating through subculture. Their larger culture, Japanese culture, has failed them in the ability to give them the tools to express themselves, to express their anxieties, their disaffection, their angst, their anger, the feeling that they have that they are unable to control the forces that they feel control them. I think the same is true of heavy metal. Heavy metal is a community that people look to when they feel powerless. It's 16-year-old men. It's 20-year-old men. It's people who feel that they cannot change the world around them, and so they seek a community that they can shape themselves. They seek a space in which they can find agency to express all of these anxieties that they have. So what can we take from this? Can we apply these lessons outside of heavy metal, outside of music, outside of subculture? I would argue that we can. Now, I'm not here to give you answers today. I just want to ask some questions. But here's the thing. The Irish Republican Army was never held up as an exemplar of Irish Catholic culture. The Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka were never held up as exemplars of Hinduism. This is what Hinduism is. The Animal Liberation Front in the United States was never held up as an exemplar of what American culture and American values are. They were seen instead as symptoms of dysfunction, as subsets of larger culture who, unable to fit within the superstructure, unable to find themselves a place within the culture of the community writ large, generated actions, generated communities in which they felt they could evoke change. Now, I'm simplifying here, of course, but I'm also using heavy metal to talk about terrorism. I'm speaking of these things as monolithic issues, but that's something the West is traditionally, historically, very good at doing when looking at non-Western cultures. This is an exercise that we're doing. But I would suggest that this civilizational paradigm that is so favored, particularly by Western politicians, particularly by American politicians, this civilizational paradigm that says that contemporary terrorism, contemporary Islamist terrorism, is a symptom of something that is wrong with culture itself, not only fails to answer questions about what produces terrorism, but rather it sets up a question that's impossible to answer. Instead, I would suggest that we look at terrorism not as a dysfunction of culture, but rather as a function of subculture. Can we come to understand something more about terrorism, not by looking at it as a cultural dysfunction, but instead by using the lens that we use to understand heavy metal? Thank you.